Hello everyone, so today we're going to be talking about another key concept in the area of behaviour management. And if you've read anything or studied anything, you've been watching my videos, you may have come across this concept of minimum necessary force, or sometimes also known as minimal necessary force. I guess it doesn't really matter, they're both pretty much the same thing. Now, the idea behind this concept is that you use the minimal amount of force necessary to affect the change that you want to see happen. Usually that is to stop the behaviour from reoccurring. Sometimes it can be to stop the behaviour in its tracks. So I want this behaviour right now to end, and then I'll be happy and I can move on and do other things. In other occasions, the minimum necessary force will mean that you have to put in a range of consequences. So it is a bit of a tiered thing, a bit of a scale. In my book, I talk about the 10 different levels. And of course, it's pretty easy and maybe somewhat naive to divide things that are as complicated as dealing with human beings' behaviour into 10 nice and neat little categories. So as you can imagine, I'm not exactly a huge fan of dividing anything into categories, particularly when we're dealing with kids, unless it's for the purpose of studying and trying to understand specifically how we go about doing things, whether we're doing things that's in a way that would be considered best practice, and it gives us the ability to, again, not only just categorize into those 10 sections, but to recategorize into lower end, mid-level, high end, and so on and so forth. But in practice, and while categories are useful, at the end of the day, there's a bit of a spectrum, so we have to just bear that in mind, that there's no such thing as a perfect level 2 behaviour, perfect level 3 behaviour, and so on and so forth. But I think I'm getting a little bit off track. Back to what we mean by minimum necessary force or minimal necessary force and why it's so important. The reason for that is because behaviour management is just so damn hard. It's difficult, it's time consuming, it's stressful, it's never ending. By the time you get to 2 o'clock on a Friday, you're just absolutely exhausted. Whether you're a teacher aide, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a trainer, no matter what you're doing as far as your work in education, you'll be dealing with human beings of some category or in some way. And of course, those constant interactions become somewhat tedious, particularly if they are negative interactions. Now you can imagine, for example, that low-key responses are used by teachers and teacher aides 300 or 400 a day, 300 or 400 times a day, and I've got a video on that, so check that one out if you don't know what low-key responses are. But that basically means that students are doing irritating little annoying things that they do all the time. Even really good students do them quite regularly, and that could just be having a chat to their friend at an inappropriate time, or it might just be dropping a piece of rubbish on the floor, even if inadvertently, but these are behaviours that need to be dealt with in some way. The thing is, working with kids such as year 9s or year 3s or whatever, we're dealing with that type of stuff literally 400 or 500 times a day. And in fact, really good teachers and teacher aides are being so proactive that they're doing it almost constantly. Behaviour management and our instructional strategies and the way in which we approach trying to teach things to kids really kind of come together, because we do know the research is very clear in that if our behaviour management isn't on the ball, then kids don't spend a huge amount of time learning, and their learning is significantly affected. So we do want to make sure that, because it is so stressful, because behaviour management takes up so much time, we want to do what we can to minimise the amount of stress and the amount of effort and the amount of time that it takes to deal with these different issues. Now, as with everything that I talk about, it's important to think about what your goal is. If you're going to do something, you should have a goal. And if your goal is quite simple, if it's just to stop that behaviour, then think about the way in which you deal with that situation with that goal in mind. Now, if your goal is to not only stop it but prevent it from happening again because you are worried that it's going to happen again, then that's a completely different reaction on your part and a completely different strategy. It may not be a different strategy, but it probably is, because we deal with individual behaviours that we're not expecting anything to happen for a repetitive event or repetitive occurrence very differently to highly repetitive behaviour. So that's the basics of why we use minimal necessary force. And you may remember back in your childhood when you were in school and a student did something silly and the teacher slammed a ruler over their desk or was yelling and screaming and carrying on like a bat out of hell. Now, unfortunately, we still get adults who claim to be professionals who do this in the real world. And I always like to remind you that if you are a professional, and our teacher aides who we train, our teachers who we train are professionals and should view themselves as being professionals. And just like all professionals, accountants, lawyers, so on and so forth, you generally don't go to work expecting to abuse and yell at other people, just like we don't go to work expecting to be yelled and abused at. So it's important to think about your work in the concept or in a frame of being a professional. How would a professional pilot behave? How would a professional writer or a professional lawyer or so on behave? And so on and so forth. So just bear that in mind as you're thinking about this concept, because as the analogy or as that image that I was trying to evoke before of the teacher or teacher aide yelling and screaming and slamming things and punching walls or punching desks or whatever, that usually happens because that individual feels that that's the only strategy that's going to work. And we know that there are lots of different strategies. And that's not to say that you can't raise your voice. It's not to say that you can't be firm or strict. In fact, I'm quite firm and strict in the way I go about my behaviour management, particularly in terms of dealing with the day-to-day occurrences that happen, such as litter on the floor, noise volume, time on learning, hands up, those types of things. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be a crazy person and be yelling and screaming or whatnot. And the minimal necessary force helps us deal with these behaviours in a way that gives us an indication of what's the most appropriate way to deal with whatever we see. Now, let me give you a little bit of a rundown of the process that happens when we're dealing with minimal necessary, when we're dealing with an issue. There is a process that we typically follow. It's a 4 or 5 step process, depending on how you think of it. And again, it happens really quick. If you're planning things out and being very proactive, it may take a little bit longer, but generally speaking, this is a bit of a process that takes a matter of milliseconds, particularly once you get more experienced, but you can stop and think about the different aspects on a regular basis. So the first thing that happens is that we observe what is going on. So we observe the behaviour. And that means, for example, we're standing here or sitting here and we see this particular student throw a piece of paper across the room into the bin, but it misses the bin and just goes on the floor, and the student turns around and just ignores it with no intention to go and pick that piece of paper up. That's our example. So we observe that behaviour. We haven't done anything yet. All we've done is observe it. Now, the second thing we're going to do is to rank that behaviour. We need to make a decision, and I like to think of it out of a scale of 1 to 10. On a scale of 1 to 10, how impactful or how serious is that particular behaviour? Now, you could also think of it as a low, medium, high thing. You could think of it in terms of the other 2 or 4 categories in the types of behaviour. So watch that video, because there are 2 main categories. I like to use 4, but really you could think of it, is it a disruptive behaviour or is it a behaviour of concern? So they're very different things, and the same behaviour for different students can fall into that category, whereas and the reverse as well. So it depends on different factors. I won't go into that in any more depth, but watch the video on that. And I guess you could probably say that this is 1 to 5, and this is probably where it goes from 6 to 10 in terms of that scale of 1 to 10. Again, I'm just being a bit simplistic here to try and give you an idea. But point is, we have to figure out how to rank it in some way. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to say, well, that's a 2 out of 10, and that's a 3 out of 10, or that's a 2.2, or that's a 2.7, or whatever. We're not really too concerned about where exactly it ranks on that scale. Whether it's a 2, whether it's a 3, doesn't really matter all that much. But we do need to know whether it's a 1 or whether it's a 4 or whether it's a 2 or whether it's a 6, for example. So that's basically what we mean by ranking it. And you might have your own ranking system, but in my head, I like to just casually sometimes think that's a 3, that's a 1, that's not even a 1, that's a 7, things like that. So there's probably no consistency to that. There's no right or wrong, but it just gives you something of an idea. And when we're doing a lot of proactive strategies or proactive planning, particularly for very challenging classes, going through and writing up all the behaviours that we come across or are likely to come across, and then ranking it out of 10 is not a bad way to go. It gives us a good starting point anyway. Okay, so then we get to number 3, 4, and number 5. Number 3 is outcome. Number 4 is strategy. And number 5 is consequence. Okay, so number 3 is where we consider what the outcome is that we want to achieve. Do we have or goal? Another way to think of it is a goal. That's the term that I like to use most often. So when we see a behaviour like a student throwing a piece of paper, our goal is to get that student to pick up the piece of paper and not to do it again. That's quite obvious, I would think. But sometimes we don't expect it to be repetitive. I'm not assuming that that student is going to do it again. So therefore, we don't need to follow up with any type of real consequence. And in that case, our goal is very simple and well defined. Sometimes though, things start to get a bit more complicated, particularly if that behaviour is repetitive or it's attached to some type of behaviour management plan and so on. So the other issue that can complicate the outcome is if there is a disability or disorder involved, or maybe it's just the last 10 or 15 minutes of class where we tend to get a bit lax with our behaviour management because we want to survive and go to recess or lunch and have our coffee. While not necessarily best practice, that does happen. People are starting to lose concentration towards the end. So for some behaviours, we are a little bit easier on. And the same applies for a late afternoon, Friday afternoon, that type of stuff. Teachers and teacher aides are usually much more relaxed about the behaviour at that particular time than they are at, say, 9 o'clock on a Monday morning when students are getting into doing their spelling or whatever they're doing on that particular day. So we're first observing it, then we're giving it something of a rank, a broad sort of rank, and then we're thinking about what do we want to achieve here, and then we're thinking of the strategy that we're going to employ. Now this is the important part here, and this is where we're employing one of the reactive strategies. So I just recently finished a video about proactive strategies versus reactive strategies. This is very reactive. So, I mean, we can use this as a proactive strategy. In, like I was saying before, we write out we write out all the different behaviours that we think we are likely to have to deal with. So, in that sense, we are being proactive. But as this unfolds in a classroom environment, you're obviously being reactive. And the strategy for number 4 that you're going to have to do is going to be a reactive strategy because you've already observed something happen. So it has to come after the behaviour, which means it is a reactive strategy of some description. Now, there are lots of different reactive strategies that we can use, but and regardless of which one we choose and how we go about implementing it, because obviously we can have one strategy and we implement it differently depending on the student, such as a reprimand or an error correction or a low-key response or whatnot. how we do this or how we go about that technique is significantly influenced by our goal. So if that student that threw the piece of paper, if we just want them to put it in there, put it in the bin, recognise they did something wrong, but we're not expecting a repeat, and it wasn't done with any malicious intent or anything like that. So our goal is just for them to put the piece of paper in there and just, I guess, just be reminded to not be lazy or whatnot. So in that case, we're very clear about our goal, and therefore we're going to react in a certain way. So in that instance, of course, depending on the class and the scenario, it might be a case of just saying, excuse me, John, pick that up. Thank you. That's all it could be. Just a simple rep. That's just a command. You might decide to add in a little bit more of a reprimand. You might decide to add in an error correction where you're actually asking them, going through a bit of a procedure to ask them a couple of questions and getting them to practice how to put pieces of rubbish in the bin. The example I quite often use is students who walk into a class with a hat on or bouncing a ball or whatever. Error correction would involve requiring them to leave the class and to come back in a neat and orderly fashion. But in this particular case and with this example, I don't think that would be necessary. I think it was just a poor choice or a poor decision, unless the student had already done it 5 times that lesson. But in that case, the actual root cause of that behaviour is probably something different, and it could be along the lines of defiance, it could be attention seeking, it could be task avoidance, but highly repetitive behaviour, even if the surface behaviour is minor, has a slightly different root cause. Now, I've gone through and done a video for 50 minutes or something on root causes and explained that in a lot of depth, so I'd recommend watching that if you haven't already. Anyway, so that is sometimes where this process ends, but we might also implement some type of consequence. Now, a consequence, if the student throws a rubbish and they've done it a couple of times, it might be a case that you have them pick up rubbish in the classroom at break. So instead of going out to play, they have to pick up a few bits of rubbish. So there's that. That's called a natural consequence because the consequence has something of a link to the actual behaviour that you observed. And we don't have to do consequences. Sometimes I like to say that the reprimand or even your attention is enough of a consequence, particularly with those low-key responses. A low-key response is where we might just look at a student, we might just point, we might say a simple name and whatever. So they're very low-key facial expressions, body language, the lowest possible thing we can do without using words. And if we do use words, they're single words. Thank you, that type of thing. So they're low-key responses, and again, I've done a video on that, so if you're not familiar with that term, watch that, because you will need to understand those types of things to understand these types of things. I think with behaviour management, unlike the teaching strategies, where you can probably watch a video or two on teaching strategies and it might make sense, with the behaviour management type videos, you really need to watch, I wouldn't say all of them, but particularly the bigger ones, particularly the bigger ones like root causes of behaviour management, the types of behaviour, proactive versus reactive. Those are the types of videos where I would certainly recommend watching all of them, because even though I've divided them into little areas, they do rely on each other significantly if you are trying to be really effective in how you go about doing your behaviour management, particularly in challenging classrooms. Okay, so we may or may not do a consequence. So sometimes this one just doesn't really exist, doesn't really need to exist, but that's a decision that you get to make. And again, this can take milliseconds, but it's also good to really think through, like anything that we do when we're working with students, to get good at things, even though we may do it really quickly. And like anything, whether it's surfing or playing golf, it's good to break it down into very granular levels so that we can think through which sections we're doing well on and which sections we're doing poorly on. And by the way, just to let you know, before we were talking about good practice or what is not good practice, and what some people still do, and that's going way overboard when they're reacting to students who might accidentally swear or something like that. And obviously, again, that depends on the individual. We all have slightly different standards. But where they're going wrong is they're probably doing that. So they're observing, well, they are doing that because they're observing the behaviour. They're actually ranking it, but they're probably ranking it in a way that is very different to how we would or you would normally rank it. So if a student was to accidentally swear, there's no malicious intent or anything there. That student probably sees or hears swear words 1,000 times a night when they go home. I mean, who knows what environment they're living in. So maybe we'll rank that at a 3 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10. They shouldn't do it, but if it's just a one-off, not a problem. If they start doing it more, maybe it's a 6 out of 10 or something like that. They swear directly at you, then obviously that's quite high up there again. So, but quite often we see people where they're, instead of ranking something at a 3, they're ranking it at a 7 straight away. So they're jumping to that level 7 where they really shouldn't be. And part of the reason for doing that is because a lack of that individual is not thinking through this type of process, or they've never been through a process where they've really thought about what this behaviour means. Why is the student doing it? What is the root cause of this behaviour? So that's while they're doing this, in that sense, they're doing it incorrectly, or they're not doing it in a way that takes into account those root causes and the purpose for why a student is doing certain things. So again, it doesn't mean we can't be strict, and it doesn't mean we can't raise our voice, and it doesn't mean we can't expect and demand really good behaviour from all students, but it does mean that we can't be screaming and yelling at kids because they accidentally dropped a piece of paper on the floor, because that wouldn't comply with this idea of minimal necessary force. And if you're working in a challenging school where you're dealing with a lot of kids who are loud and boisterous or whatnot, then if you're constantly jumping to a level 7, then you're going to be really, really stressed. So you should and it's going to take away from learning time. The classroom dynamic's going to be poor. Rapport with kids is going to be really poor. It causes so many problems. So if you can stay around level 1 out of 10 for as long as possible and as often as possible, while still maintaining control and still helping students improve their behaviour and dealing with behaviours, then that's where you would ideally want to be for your own stress and for the calmness of the class and that positive classroom dynamic. So it's kind of, I guess, in a way, a bit of a balancing act. Okay, so we'll rub that off and we'll get it moving. Now, we're talking about this level, this idea of classifying behaviours into levels and all this kind of stuff, and obviously there are issues with that, but it is important to classify things in a way so then we can just look at them and talk about them. Obviously, you can have your own systems. I like to call this the scale of undesirable behaviour. And sometimes I add on and proportionate responses. But let's call this a scale of undesirable behaviour, right? Sounds kind of evil or something, doesn't it? Now, that word undesirable behaviour is kind of the new PC way of saying kids that are misbehaving, but that's basically what that means. Now, and that's because sometimes they're not, the idea of misbehaving means, has that, I guess, that insinuation that students are choosing to misbehave. So we tend to use words like undesirable behaviour when we're doing individual behaviour plans and things like that. But to be honest, when we're in schools and things, 90% of teachers still just use words like challenging behaviour or misbehaving is perfectly fine. Personally, that's just my opinion anyway. As long as we know what we're talking about, we're not purposely going out of our way to be offensive or anything. Okay, so down the side, we quite often have 10 different levels. Let's see, I'm going to run out of room. No, I don't really need to go above 8 anyway. Yes, we do. Okay, so there's 10. And we'll just do the first couple. Daydreaming, tapping a pen. Okay, so now let's assume that this is sort of a level of seriousness, through lack of a better word, where level 1 is kind of, it's a behavioural issue, but we're pretty much going to ignore it. So down, let's do a little table here. So this is what we see, and over here is what we're going to do about it. So this is the observation, and this is the strategy or the response. And so over this side, we would probably just ignore this one. So we can completely ignore it. I do that once a webinar, I swear. Ignore. Okay, so there we go. So if a student is and that doesn't mean we have to, and that we're always going to, but if we do classify it as level 1, and lots of other things are at level 1, they're not disrupting any other students. It might be a bit irritating because they might not be listening to your instructions, but generally speaking, we might ignore it, what is known as tactfully ignoring. So that's a level 1, and that's only an example. It's an example. So you're working in a class, you've got 30 students, you're sitting there, you want to work with this particular student for the next 5 minutes. You see a couple of things going on over there, student turns around, they have a quick chat to their friend and start working again. That's kind of a level 1, we just ignore it. And again, maybe you'll classify that as level 2, maybe level 3, it's really up to you. If you've been very clear with those students that they are not to talk under any circumstances for the next 10 minutes because it's a timed reading session, and then within 30 seconds some student starts talking, obviously that's not a level 1. That's very different to if it's just, students are just reading in the library for 20 minutes after lunch because it's their weekly reading session, and a student just happens to says, "Oi, put this in the bin for me because the bin's right next to them," or something. So again, it depends on the situation. Now let's say level 2, or the second type of behaviour, it gets a bit more serious. It's still low level. There's no malicious intent. The student's not consciously thinking that I'm going to do this to annoy the teacher, or I'm doing this because I want to get attention, I want to get out of work. They're just it's just a behaviour that's kind of irritating. You've got to deal with it, but it's not really a problem behaviour. It's still pretty close to daydreaming. And in that case, we may just ignore it if it goes away. We may leave it for a second or two, or we may even leave it for a little bit until we get back around there if they're still doing it, and just take note or whatnot. And quite often these things we do automatically, so we're not really thinking about them that much. We are when we're consciously trying to improve our behaviour management skills, but again, we're not really worried about it too much. Unfortunately, this is where we see a lot of teachers, teacher aides in particular, who are new to the industry, very little experience, and they're not really sure about how to go about dealing with these things, or they're not really sure what their role is in the classroom. So they may see something that we think is probably at a level 2, and that, say, 95% of experienced teachers will put at level 2, and they treat it like it's a level 4. So you're not miles away, and you're not being completely ridiculous, but what's happening is for something that's at a level 2, we really should be doing a low-key response of some description. So that means we're trying to do something that isn't interrupting other students, ideally. So if someone's tapping a pen, then it might be just something very simple. It might be a case of if a student's tapping a pen, you're just walking up and just grabbing the pen off them and putting it on the desk. So something very, very simple, again, low key. It doesn't interrupt the flow of the lesson. And all of these ones here, I guess you could say there's something of a hierarchy there where there's no interruption, tiny interruption, something of an interruption, serious big interruption, evacuate the class type thing. So the level of, and it's not only what it interrupts other students, but it interrupts the teaching, it interrupts the lesson, it interrupts the amount of time spent on learning, and so on and so forth. So that's the first 2. They kind of go in their own little category. We do that naturally. We don't need to think about it too much. The important thing there is to make sure that you categorize, that if it is a level 1 or 2 type level, then you can either ignore it or just deal with it in a way that doesn't disrupt anyone else. And making sure that you're not, for example, where possible, and in an ideal world, you're not raising your voice to get the attention of the student that's on the other side of the class who's tapping their pen. Because again, that may not seem like a big deal, but if you're doing that 20 times a lesson, it does become, I guess, a little interrupting. But, if you were to tell a student who was on the other side of the room, "John, stop tapping, thank you," then it's probably not a huge amount of interruption, but best practice would have you do low-key responses, which is a way of dealing with things without other students noticing. So very, very low-key. Okay, cool. New pen time. Let's go blue. So whispering. Let's do the next 2 or 3. Interrupting. I'll move in 1 second. We'll do number 5. Just, walking around room. Even number 6, repeat. And number 7, attention seeking. Okay, so sorry about that. I just wanted to write a few up because then you can see how they flow down. Now, there is a bit of a jump here because now number 3 is where, and the example of a number 3 is where a student is actually not just doing something accidentally, they're doing something on purpose now, and it's starting to become a bit of an interruption, and that's where they might just be whispering to a friend. And that's not necessarily a case of just a quick little whisper. That's usually they're doing silent reading and they're trying to have something of a conversation, or they're doing it more than once. So there's a little bit of repetitiveness about it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a level 6 because this is a different type of repetitiveness. This is just something that needs dealing with where your low-key responses aren't really working. Now, what I would consider, if you've done a low-key response, you might actually just repeat the low-key response here. So it might just be a reminder, something of a warning. It might be another low-key response, as I was saying, or you might decide to escalate, because all of these are, again, if one doesn't work and you make the decision that you want to escalate, which is another concept that I talk about a lot in behaviour management and is pretty well known in the behaviour management world, or the behaviour management topic, I guess you could say. If this doesn't work, but it continues, then you'll need to do something more to get that to stop. Now, there is an assumption in a lot of behaviour management programs that you need to escalate, which means you're going to something that's ever more, I guess, serious and gives you and addresses the problem more and more face on, particularly in these lower ones. But sometimes actually you can then do what I call a reverse escalation, and that's where if you've already done this one, you might actually then ignore the next behaviour, and that's sometimes called the secondary behaviour because kids might continue on with it, but just for a little bit. And sometimes you can just ignore it and it'll just go away. Other times, if you've already done a reminder, sometimes instead of escalating, you can go backwards. So you could go from there to the low-key response and just something like that, or a quick point, or a little bit of a facial expression or whatnot. Standing near the student might be another way of going about doing that. Another low-key response that's relatively well known is pausing. So that's where if you're talking to students and you just stop talking and it's very sort of jarring and confronting, particularly if you're dealing with a group of students and you stop and you face off, what they call face off with that student, and pause and start looking at them and give them a bit of what they call a teacher stare. But anyway, they're sort of low-key responses, but you're starting to move into these other areas because, again, a low-key response is supposed to not interrupt the rest of the class or other students. And other students aren't supposed to know that it's really even happening, generally speaking. Although, again, I guess it depends who's watching. But that's a little side note there. So if you are... Every time I draw this table, by the way, I do these all differently because it depends on the example you're going through and whatnot. But if you're seeing a student whisper, and that's the only thing that they've done wrong, then maybe the natural consequence of that, or the natural reaction, the strategy you're going to do, is going to just be some type of, well, it could be a reminder. Actually, I suppose that doesn't really make sense because a reminder would come after some type of initial warning. So let's call that a correction. Okay, and maybe there's some type of follow-up reminder after that as well. Now, okay, so moving on, and again, low-key things. This is just, even the best kids have days where they do things like this. Nothing to be concerned about. If you do know that it's low-key, and you can be dealt sort of in this range, in this low-key area, you could use low-key here where possible. In fact, that'd probably be ideal with the interruption one. Which is where students are talking out of turn, as they say. Talking out of turn is, again, teacher talk or education type talk for students that are interrupting you while you're talking to students. They're interrupting their peers, they're yelling or screaming, or they're maybe not screaming, but they're talking when they should be quiet and they should be quietly working and so on. So we'll just call that an interruption. Now, it's a little bit more than whispering, because whispering is obviously there's an attempt there to try and keep quiet or cover up the behaviour or whatnot. Interruption, this is where we're starting to get into attention-seeking territory, and students who are being sort of being a little bit rude sometimes. So level 4, and it's starting to get up there a little bit. Half of the students in your class, even in more challenging classes, won't get outside of that. And a lot of behaviour is around that number 3. Number 4 is probably more than half, I'd say. And number 4 is where you start to think this is where you actually are using things like corrections, or a quick chat is another thing that you could do in that particular instance. So these two kind of fall into a very similar category. Again, it depends on the extent of the interruption and whether that is combined with, if it's happened before, if the student does it every lesson, or if it's just a once-off or whatnot. So the next one we want to start talking about is number 5. And now level 5, again, starts to get a little more serious. I wrote walking, but I guess it's, I'm going to cross that one out. We're going to call it out of seat. So this is the student who is getting up, walking around. They're constantly out of their seat. It's a little bit more than the interruption, because they are doing both of these things in many instances. You'll know that if you've been in classes where you've got students that are doing that type of behaviour, it is getting, I guess, more serious, because it causes problems in terms of how to the extent to which it disrupts other students, the extent to which it disrupts the teaching process, and the extent and the risk that it leads to other problems. So if you let students get up and they're walking around and they just decide, I'm going to go sit over there, and they stand up, they go sit over there for 5 minutes, and then they come back and they sit down, or I just wanted to tell my friend something, that type of thing. That type of behaviour is almost manipulative in a way. They're playing, they're sort of playing the system a little bit, because and they'll start saying things like, well, I was only over there for 30 seconds. I just had to tell them something because my mum wanted me to go tell him that after school they've got to do a special thing. So there'll always be some excuse for that, and it'll be repetitive, because it'll happen once and it'll always happen a second or third time. If it only happens once, it's probably up here a bit. It's probably number 3. It's a student who just got out of their seat to put the piece of rubbish in the bin just after you told them not to, or just after you told them that no, everyone is to be working quietly, and they just forgot that and got out of their seat and whatever. In which case you're dealing with a simple correction, please sit back down type of thing. Nothing to be serious. This is where you've got those chronic, you're starting to get repeat offenders. You're starting to get students who are just pushing the boundaries a little bit. Number 5 is where things get more serious, and we're beyond low-key responses in most cases. We're beyond a quick little correction, and we're starting to think about how we can minimise that distraction. So again, there's lots of different ways we can go about doing that, but that can be a seating plan or some type of pre-correction. Pre-corrections is a really good one. So there's lots of different strategies that we can put around that one. The same with repeat. So any type of behaviour that is quite repetitive can be considered in some instances as being defiant behaviour. So even someone tapping a pen, but if the student is effectively refusing to stop doing that, then they're being actively defiant. And in that case, that tapping the pen is no longer a number 2. It jumps back up and is probably a number 5 or a 6, depending on the student. It could also even be up further if it's a part of a trending pattern of behaviour where it looks like it's some type of manipulative, power-seeking type thing. But that's extremely rare. I think sometimes we're tricked into thinking that maybe that's the case and this kid is evil or whatever, but that does happen, and we do get kids who have diagnosed disorders of that nature, but very rarely is it actually purely for power-seeking, sabotage, revenge type reasons, even though it may seem like it on the outset. And that's not to say that kids don't do that occasionally, but power seekers are actually not just students in a bad mood on that day because you put a consequence in place that they don't like. It's that pattern of behaviour every day for months on end type of thing in multiple different scenarios, and not just with you, but with multiple different teachers or teacher aides. Because disorders and disabilities the signs and symptoms of those don't just happen in one area or one location. You can't have a disability or a disorder. Like ADHD does not only apply to art or to English. It has to also apply to maths and to science, and the signs and symptoms have to be across the board. It's not to say they're not going to behave differently, but disabilities and disorders are, and that's how they're diagnosed as well. That's a part of that diagnosis. Does the same behaviour occur at home as it does at school? Does it occur in this topic as well as that topic, and so on and so forth? So anyway, so this is where things start to become more serious, and we start to call it a level 5 or 6. Now, I just want to take you back to the start of this webinar. Remember we were talking about goals? So if we are to talk about, let's do another little column, see where this takes us. Now, remember, if a student is interrupting, let's say they're tapping their pen. Our goal right now is just for them to immediately stop. So a low-key response is more than adequate in that sense. If they're whispering and it's not repetitive, we want them to stop. So maybe a low-key, but maybe we say, stop doing that. If it's an interruption, it might require a quick chat, because if that student is happy to interrupt you whenever they feel like it, but they're not being rude, but they just don't quite get that social norm, or maybe they don't quite understand that expectation, then you need to set that expectation and be very clear about it. Right, adults, human beings, when we're interacting with each other, if I'm talking, you don't talk. Does that make sense to you? Yes. Okay, thank you. That's a quick little chat. Now, when we get to the out of seat bit, maybe it's becoming serious enough that we start thinking about being a bit more proactive. So in this sense, goals are changing here because we need to prevent we're preventing repetitive behaviour or more serious behaviour. So it's not just a one-off, we need to deal with it now so we can go on and continue teaching. This is a known problem that needs active forethought and processes and systems and whatnot to be put in place. Now, when we start to get to, I'm just going to draw a little line there like that. And if it is repetitive, for example, then pre-corrections and seating plans and things like that are going to work, but we might also need some type of IBP for that student. Maybe we're not quite at that IBP stage yet. Actually, yeah, I'm going to say we're probably not quite at that IBP stage yet. Oops. Because I really want to save that for down here. I mean, again, you can use those specific plans for up here. But really, at that level, we're looking at doing as many different procedures and processes that we can without going to that systematic level or that formal sort of systematic level where possible. So at this point, we've got expectations, or say new sort of rules that specifically applies to that student. So we might be, again, putting them in a seating plan and so on and so forth. So that can be one way of going about dealing with that. And with that chronic attention seeking, let's say one of the strategies is instructional design. So we're going to differentiate our instruction for that particular student. Plus we've got specific expectation, rules, consequences involved for that particular sort of repeat offender type thing at that level. And again, when we get to level 8, 9, 10, this is where it gets to the point where you're no longer dealing with this as an individual. So teachers will deal with that. Teacher aides will deal with that on their own. in a team, one-on-one, so on and so forth. Even with the attention-seeking type behaviour, you're putting consequences in place. Obviously you can change the way in which you do things a little bit. You're differentiating a little bit. It can be faster-paced activities. It can be, they can work outside. You can play some games instead, and you're making even just little tweaks. Not necessarily massive tweaks, but you're doing various different proactive things here. And again, that's just one option. I'm not saying that if you have a student that is attention-seeking, you must do some instructional design work. That's not the case. That's one of 10 different things that you could possibly do. But if a student's tapping their pen, you're not going to change your instruction. You're not going to change the way you're going about designing lesson plans or the activities you're doing. You're not going to go through a massive differentiation process. Just as the reverse works. If you've got attention-seeking students, you might use some type of low-key responses, but this will be within some type of multi-pronged approach. So, because what happens down here is quite often you're using a lot of those things, but all at the same time, or all within as some type of, I guess you could say, process type thing. So, now down here, this is where you've got, say, violence, repetitive at level 6, and number 8, you've got, I guess, aggression and your meltdown type thing. So this is where it gets sort of, you've also got safety concerns and whatnot. So aggression, your meltdown, where students are running away or throwing a chair or whatever. Repetitive at level 6. I generally say level 6. So that's where we're either probably level 6, because let's level 6 plus, because when you get to level 7, if it's attention seeking is one thing, but then when it gets to a certain point that it's constant, then you've got problems. So I guess that's just a severity type area there, but not quite level 10. Level 10 is where it becomes full-blown violent, and that's a whole different kettle of fish altogether. So because one thing is to have that aggressive meltdown or threatening type thing. I guess violence or threats or intimidation or whatever, they sort of go in that top level there. And again, anything above level 8 isn't really something that an individual teacher or an individual teacher aide would ever really need to deal with in isolation. It'll be as a part of some type of behaviour plan, and usually in combination with parents and other disability support specialists, medical specialists, and so on. It's quite often not caused, you very rarely will come across this. Even, I'm trying to think back of some of the most difficult students or most challenging students that I've had to deal with over the years. And normally, sometimes they might be, I guess, they're definitely level 7 type thing, where you do need to go through that process of changing your instruction. You're doing a lot of different things there, putting on behaviour contracts and so on and so forth. So actually, we were saying before that this is definitely an IBP, but this kind of goes beyond being that planning level. This is where they're more so moving into specialist programs and things like that. Now, that's for students with disabilities, but also students without disabilities. If they're showing that type of behaviour. And if they're showing that type of behaviour, then they probably do have a disability or a disorder, just hasn't been diagnosed, or they're on drugs or something like that. Obviously, there are some exceptions. If it's a year 1 kid who's just a bit upset or something, that might be a bit different. But again, depending on the situation. So here is definitely where we can do IBPs. We're also doing a lot of proactive stuff, such as red card system and orange card system and behaviour cards and various different things. So I think I'll probably wrap that one up there. And just remember, of course, the scale from 1 to 10 is very fluid. It doesn't necessarily, I don't really care whether it's a 1 or a 1.5. I mean, it doesn't. As long as you have an idea that this behaviour is kind of a level 2 or a level 3. You don't even have to use 1 to 10 if you want. You can use 1 to 50. You could use a 1 to 100. You could use 1 to 3. I don't really care. You could use low, medium, high, very high. It makes no difference. The point is, I think, for me personally, I think it's important just to write out not to write out, but to think about the types of behaviours that you're coming across in the classroom, and to just kind of match them across. That's the whole idea of minimum necessary force. So we've got this behaviour here, the student's whispering. What is the minimum thing that I have to do to achieve this goal? And my goal is to stop it from happening. I'm not expecting a repeat. What is the minimum thing I have to do to stop it? And that is just a quick little correction. If we came down here and you've got attention seekers, so students who are attention seeking, now your goal is not going to be to stop that, because you're never going to achieve that. That's not a SMART goal. And when I say SMART, I mean S-M-A-R-T. I have a video on that, watch that. It's not a SMART goal. It's not reasonable to expect that you're going to stop it. But you can minimise it. So your goal might be to minimise how disruptive that student is to the point where, they're only out of their seat 4 times in a lesson, and they're only talking out of turn or whatnot 4 times in a lesson. So let's say you aim for 4, and they're your 2 goals, 4 and 4. So you use a bunch of strategies to be able to plan that out, maybe not in an IBP, but in some type of formal system with that student. And you're also looking at changing your instruction. So the strategies that you're using. If you're using a set and forget, a set and circulate type model where you're setting work and then circulating for an hour, well, of course you're going to have problems. But if you're going to do some type of explicit instruction type thing, or whatever you're doing where it's just fast paced and very structured, then that's probably, hopefully, going to reduce those type of issues quite substantially. And certainly that does work for these students. Also, you're doing things like movement interaction that we're talking about before. You're doing games and quizzes, even year 9s and whatnot, year 12s, they love doing quizzes. You're just looking at using more authentic text that's of interest to them, building more rapport, so on and so forth. So you might be able to list out for that one student a bunch of different things that you can do, and then it's sort of attacking it with that multiple pronged approach to see how you go. Another video that I've got is about, I call it relocation refusers. And what I mean by relocation refusers is students that are in a seat and they refuse to move to that seat, because if you've been in any challenging school, or any school really, from K to 12, teachers and teacher aides are always trying to get, mainly teachers, kids to move from there to there. Because maybe they're not working properly, or there are issues, or that student is constantly talking to the other student, or whatever. So we want to move that student for behavioural reasons. That's usually probably maybe there, can be there, tends to be further up, but quite often we do it there, probably not here. Once it starts to get repetitive here maybe, but then again that'll be more down at this sort of level. Yeah, I'd say level 4 or 5. I mean, by the time you get down here, they're already moved anyway, and you're probably not going to be moving seats. You're going to be moving them out of the class. But, I mean, again, it depends on what's going on. So, watch that video on relocation refusers, because if that happens and you're trying to move students, then, again, your goals are changing, and you're going to have, you're going to be going about that process quite differently. Okay, so that's the minimum necessary force, and please watch those other videos that are related to these other behaviour management strategies, because they are important and they do integrate with each other, and I hope they are all useful, and good luck out there.